Hi everybody, I'm Michael, and this is Regeneration, a place where people who are in their 40s and 50s and beyond find a place to re-energize and regenerate themselves and to keep renewing in a increasingly chaotic and changing world. Today we're going to dive into rediscovering joy. And in order to prove my Gen X bona fides and to prove that I am not a boomer, no matter what that lady in Aldi said to me, I'm going to talk to you about Pool of Radiance, a game that hit me when I was 18 years old and freshly into the military. But first, before we do that, a little bit of context. In the 1980s, everything, and I mean literally everything, was a cause for panic. There was the continuing, ongoing anti-gay panic and the worry that AIDS virus was super communicable. There were accusations of daycares kidnapping children and inculcating them into satanic rituals and sacrificing them to Satan. Weirdly enough, daycares. There was the lyrical panics of the 1980s, the PMRC hearings. And of course, you can't forget the satanic panic.
It began as a cult phenomenon, then it caught on. Now a new game is sweeping the country.
You will burn forever and ever in eternal torment. You are no more.
The role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons debuted in 1974. It became a hit with many adolescents, but critics claimed it was an invitation to devil worship.
The witchcraft, the demonism, the spells.
And worse.
It is not fun and games.
The media set off a satanic panic.
A lot of adults who think it's been connected to a number of suicides and murders.
That connection has been largely debunked.
It's nothing but a witch hunt.
In 1988, TSR, the publisher of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, approached a veteran war game simulator, SSI, or Strategic Simulations Incorporated, to build a faithful adaptation of the AD&D rules. This close collaboration, some would say more of a control, allowed for a game that AD&D fans would be very familiar with. Now, it's not as approachable to newcomers as it was to veteran players, but spells, magic items, and certain concepts were introduced in the game. The result was Pool of Radiance. Pool of Radiance was the first in what was later known as the Gold Box series, a total of 11 games that would eventually be published, that allowed for deep character customization, including character appearance, with several male and female heads and bodies available. It had a sweeping story that usually resulted in combat, but not always. The artwork, depending on the platform upon which it was published, was relatively faithful to the official materials. And it is, for lack of a better term, the original Soulslike game. Now, it's not quite a roguelike in that it has static maps that you can repeat over and over again, but it was Souls-like in that there were many, many chances for instant death. Now, save scumming was possible, but it was incredibly cumbersome, because not only after your character had died would you have to stop, save the game, exit out of the program, enter back in, re-authenticate yourself, and hopefully load from an earlier save that you remembered to set up. Gameplay-wise, it's as tactical as both the publisher and the franchise owner would want it to be. In this case, facing mattered, especially for thieves. In order to get that precious backstab, they literally had to be facing the opposite way. Your victims, that is, had to be facing the opposite way. Area effect spells didn't have any kind of warning about where they would affect, no preview of what the spell would look like, so you had to be careful not to catch your teammates, or else they may fall victim to your magic as well. Poison, diseases, curses in AD&D were no joke. Diseases and curses could cause you to wither away until death, or in the case of poison, it was instant death, making scorpions, snakes, and others incredibly deadly in combat. Also, weight mattered. Everything had weight. Although your characters started off with a base 12 squares of movement and could be reduced to 3 squares before the game would refuse you the ability to acquire more items, or even money, when you are in a tactical combat and you're not able to move very much, you're going to very quickly become outflanked. So you had to balance the money that you dragged with you and the equipment that you had on you with your ability to be effective in combat. On top of that, healing was few and far between. Cure Light Wounds does all of your healing for you. The occasional potion here and there could indeed heal you, but most of the time your clerics are going to be hard-pressed to cast that Cure Light Wounds, that precious 1d8, and yes, it was randomized, of healing onto your characters. So a particularly nasty battle might take you literally days of resting to recover. The gameplay was surprisingly reactive on top of that. Even given how primitive the programming was, the enemies did prioritize flanking, trying to get to your rear ranks as fast as possible, hopefully to take out your mage and or your clerics. Walls, doorways, and even trees and rocks mattered, but you had to be also careful of things like lightning bolt. Casting the spell Lightning Bolt could allow it to bounce off of a wall. Therefore, if somebody cast it in front of the fighter and we'll say cleric, it could go through the fighter, the cleric, to an empty space behind them, bounce off the wall, and repeat in reverse those strikes again, forcing them to make more saving throws and take more damage. Enemies, if they saw that the fight was not going their way, if it slogged on, their morale could crumble, and they could either surrender or flee if fighting wasn't going well, running all the way to the edge of the map and eventually disappearing. This was also an early attempt at 3D graphics. In combat, it was a kind of quasi-isometric 3D, though not quite. There lacked some of the shading and some of the nuance that later games would have. It's not much to look at now, and it really wasn't the first to try that isometric 3D graphics, but it was groundbreaking nonetheless, even if it was a little wonky. In order to save disk space, the programmers did something rather ingenious. There were no hints or clues as to secret doors, illusory walls, or anything that could be hidden underneath floorboards or up in ceilings. You had to literally search, and because in the 3D environment, all the areas looked exactly the same, it often meant that the party was moving very slowly, making themselves much more vulnerable to being attacked by random monsters. On top of that, the programmers would put the tavern rumors, official proclamations, and game notes in a printed material in order to save disk space. Now sometimes these rumors or proclamations or even clues would be fake outs. Later games would even build upon this in order to not spoil the quest line as you were reading through. Reference to objects within the game, such as magical items like the Manual of Bodily Health, were there for hardcore AD&D players who know, or at least had access to, the Dungeon Master's Guide and all of the explanation of the magical items inside. Returning to that example of the Manual of Bodily Health, in the original AD&D rules, you had to study the manual for 30 days, uninterrupted. And then you had to practice the manual for an additional 100 days on top of that in order for the effect to take place, which was to raise your constitution by 1 point. In an era before statistics could be increased, this was an incredibly powerful magical item and often was worth the wait. So luckily in Gold Box games, there really wasn't a ticking clock per se. You didn't have to do something by sundown or within X amount of days. This allowed you to take a long extended break in the civilized areas, hold up in a tavern or hold up in an inn, and study until you were ready. The storyline in Pool of Radiance was typically high adventure. In Gygaxian early D&D, there was no question of why should I care about this mission or what's my motivation. To Gary Gygax's view, You were an adventurer. There was an adventure right over there, maybe a ruined city or a dungeon or an evil temple, and therefore that was your whole reason for existing. You were an adventurer, you go find adventure, you defeat monsters, you gather treasure, you lather, rinse, repeat. Often in the early handbooks, monsters rarely were considered people. Pool of Radiance, however, does diverge from that in several instances. There can be an experience of coming across a dying kobold that you can give water to, who in gratitude will give you a clue that is necessary for you to solve a puzzle. You can allow children hobgoblins to run away. You can even convince enemy lieutenants to turn sides, at least for one battle. This is probably the influence of more nuanced writers who came on in the mid and late 80s, people like Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman. Pool of Radiance also had adventure everywhere. Yes, most of the story does take place in the city of Phlan, but some missions took place outside of the city walls. There were multiple divergent paths to accomplishing a mission, and it was up to you to decide which one you would prioritize. Now, some missions impacted others, so the order in which you completed them often played a key part in how successful you were. City council rewards were also where the XP and money was at. Killing creatures yielded a little bit of experience points, true, but comparatively they were rather paltry. It was necessary to complete these missions in order to get enough experience so that you would be a viable party moving forward in later missions. So TSR kept SSI on a tight leash over the next 4 years and really went through the programming with a fine-tooth comb to ensure that both the Pool of Radiance and the successor games were faithful to the AD&D license. By the end of the 4 years and the 11 games that eventually were published by SSI, the hands were untied, and SSI, although stating publicly that they parted amicably, privately expressed relief that they no longer had to worry about TSR looming over their shoulders. Pool of Radiance and Advanced Dungeons & Dragons are, unfortunately, a product of its time. In this case, for Pool of Radiance, multiple platforms give different graphical experiences. I was lucky enough when I was a young man to be able to play this on Commodore hardware, which was much more user-friendly and much more keen to show off graphics and sound and colors. The type that you can get now is often ported over from the old IBM DOS files, which were much more limited in their expression of colors and, of course, their sounds. Trust me, I'm sparing you by not giving you any of the sounds right now. AD&D had some assumptions and characterizations that were inherently racist, both within the game and outside of the game. In-game kind of racial favoriting, we'll call it, allowed certain races to perhaps exceed in certain aspects, in maybe certain statistics or different classes they could exceed in, but they were limited in other classes and maybe a little bit less than their human counterparts. For example, halflings were often more dexterous than humans, but usually portrayed as less wise. AD&D also had out-of-game racism as well, kind of baked in, a kind of passive racism. The nomads, for example, that appear in Pool of Radiance are characterized as dirty, but with vaguely Middle Eastern sounding names. Sexism was baked into both AD&D and Pool of Radiance, because Pool of Radiance was extremely similar to AD&D. And so you would have women wearing chainmail bikinis, or they would often be physically weaker than their male counterparts. A woman warrior could not achieve the same massive physique as a male warrior could. So in conclusion, Pool of Radiance was a smash hit. It sold over 250,000 copies at a time when almost nobody had their own personal computer. I didn't get a personal computer until I purchased one with my own money when I was in the military, so I was already an adult. There was no internet yet, So if you wanted a pirated copy, you had to know somebody who knew somebody who had a few tricks up their sleeves. Often you had to purchase that software in the physical form. Pool of Radiance also spawned successors and spin-offs. There were 11 games, as I mentioned before, over 4 years, and they did unfortunately saturate the market. But it did offer a kind of leaping point for future games and proved to the developers that there was an appetite for this kind of fantasy role-playing game, especially for AD&D. In an era when conservative voices were increasingly hysterical about, well, everything, from movies to music, daycare to D&D, the CRPG Pool of Radiance coming out allowed for even lonely D&D nerds to have a party, a DM, and an epic quest that they could really sink their teeth into. Now, although it is fun to look back in the 1980s with a nostalgia and perhaps with some rose-tinted glasses, it's important to note that despite how it's depicted now in media, such as the series Stranger Things, D&D friendly parents were few and far between. I personally was lucky, but many of my friends were not. And it's an irony now that D&D is seen as an antidote to online social media issues. So all in all, I would say if you're looking for a retro vibe, for a tough game without super punishing, and for a look back into a period of D&D history that is largely forgotten, although starting to experience a renaissance, I would highly recommend Pool of Radiance. But what do you guys think? Are there any games that you would like to see, or any kind of role-playing game that you would like to see? Let me know in the comments down below. Remember to hit like and subscribe, and don't forget, keep on regenerating.